Welcome back. What I've got for you today is Blues and Roots. This is the brand new release and actually the very first release in the Atlantic 75 series, which Atlantic Records is doing in partnership with Acoustic Sounds. Really excited to dig into this one. As many who follow this channel know, this is one of my favorite jazz albums of all time. And in fact, I even highlighted my very recently, my top 5 jazz records of all time, mentioned this one, and the fact that it hasn't had a analog, like an all analog reissue since probably at least 1975. And then sure enough, just like a month later, a month after that video, Atlantic announced this. So obviously I was going to get it. This is the only one I've picked up so far, but this is going to kind of dictate, right, how interested I am in the rest of this series. So that's what we're going to dig in today. As usual, please go ahead and hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you get notified every time I post a new video. And I'm pretty active on Instagram, post there every day, usually just a sort of album of the day kind of thing. So head over there. My handle is what_can_brown. All right, so I think that this is going to be a particularly interesting discussion because Blues and Roots is just a difficult recording. And I'll say that kind of in two ways. I mean, one is that there's a lot of musicians here, there's spontaneous improvisation, there's like shouts and things like that, right? So there's a lot going on for the musicians, and especially when you have that kind of spontaneous improvisation and you have longer pieces, it just very likely was probably difficult to record for the musicians actually in the studio. The other, I guess, way that I mean difficult is that with so much going on, it was also likely difficult to record from an engineering standpoint. But I think that they did a phenomenal job here. I just think it was an interesting title for them to include, given that. Well, yeah, I mean, given all of what I just said, but also there has not been, I don't believe there's been an all-analog reissue of this since 1975. And so it's interesting that it's been neglected, I suppose, for that long. There is some speculation that the master tapes are destroyed. I've heard that from people just online. I've not been told that by Atlantic, nor, Acoustic Sounds didn't put it on their website. But there's been some speculation. I would say, I think we have to take that with a grain of salt, because what we've heard is that any time a record hasn't been reissued, like in an all analog kind of way, people just immediately assume that it's because the tapes are destroyed. And there was also a lot of false reporting, I think, after the Universal fire, as well as just kind of other, issues where master tapes were lost. There's a lot of false reporting about what was included and what wasn't. So I will make a reference to at least what Acoustic Sounds is saying on their website about this particular recording. All right, so just a refresher for those who maybe missed my Atlantic 75 sort of holistic video that I made a little bit ago. The situation with this series, again, is that there's 75 titles. They span across genres. Right now, the only 2 jazz musicians that are being highlighted in the series, again, in partnership with Acoustic Sounds, are John Coltrane and Charles Mingus. So those are the only 2 musicians as leaders whose work is going to appear on this list or appear in this series, again, from a sort of a jazz context. So all of these are 45 RPM, and they are all double LPs with the exception of any LPs that were originally double LP. Then they're going to have to be quadruple LP, right, in order to fit everything in that 45 RPM format. So these are 180 gram pressings as well. This particular one on Acoustic Sounds, it references that it was mastered by Kevin Gray at Coherent Audio. It does say from the original analog tapes, although to my previous comment, I'm not sure. This is, let's see, it was plated and pressed at QRP. This has a gatefold style jacket, which obviously would not have been original. It was a single jacket originally, and what they did is they added some of some nice photos. They did a great job reproducing the imagery. I have an original mono just as a sort of a point of comparison, and really the only things that they did is they kind of added the logo and disclaimer down here and the barcode towards the bottom in place of what was previously there, which was just the which was the label's address. But otherwise, Stoughton jacket, very nice feel. These are just very similar to the Prestige series that Acoustic Sounds put out. So you can be sure that it's going to be, of high quality. So otherwise, what this thing comes with in addition to obviously the 2 discs, is there is a hype sticker, and I believe this hype sticker is actually just consistent across all the releases, so it's not necessarily going to tell you the details for any particular one. This one references, yes, that it's these 75 titles, handpicked and supervised by Analog Productions CEO Chad Kassem. This hype sticker says mastered from the original analog tapes or best available source by top mastering engineers. So it just so happens they used Kevin Gray for this one. They are not using Kevin Gray for every single one. In some situations, it's Ryan K. Smith. There's a variety of other engineers, especially for the non-jazz recordings that they are using, however. And then it says cut at 45 RPM, pressed on 180 gram heavyweight vinyl, those things that I already indicated. So to the point of, what's the source for this thing? This says, it could be best available source. The Analog Productions website, or Acoustic Sounds, website, does say that it is from the original analog tapes, again, mastered by Kevin Gray. And I guess we kind of have to trust that, right? Because if they're going to put the information out there, then it's probably accurate. I don't think Acoustic Sounds typically is misleading us on some of these details. All right, so just a couple of more notes before we sort of get into the music. So this is what the original mono looks like right here. This is my original mono copy, and then you can see here this is the this is the Atlantic 75 stereo reissue. So even on the original stereo, they did add this logo, and so that's the same. Just kind of very, very minor things, and this could be aging. Keep in mind, because sometimes white covers end up getting a little bit yellow, but you'll notice that the original is a little bit more yellow. You'll also notice that that the image on the original mono is just a little bit darker tone to it. And I don't necessarily know if that's it's not a problem. There's a high degree of variability with the original covers and how they were printed, but anybody who is, gonna nitpick, they will notice that. One other element that I noticed from just a quality standpoint is that my copy, one of the discs, arrived with a little bit of a dish warp. And so I think people know what dish warp is. It's not an edge warp where the needle's going to rise and fall. It's simply the center part of the record almost is either concave or convex. It kind of like rises up. And so it isn't a problem even playing without a record clamp. It still tracks, and it's not that bad of a warp whatsoever. It's not even something that I'm going to reach out to them about, because it's not an issue. But again, I know that there's a lot of people who care about these very, very, they want to know when they spend $60 US that there's not going to be any issues. And I just thought I'd reference that. How I adjust for that is I have one of these record clamps, right? And it sits right on top of the, the spindle, and you just kind of clamp it down, and then it flattens it. It was only even a quasi issue on one of the records. All right, so let's get into the music. The lineup here is really impressive. So you've got 2 alto saxophonists in Jackie McLean and John Handy. You have Pepper Adams on baritone sax. You have Booker Irvin on tenor sax. You have Danny Richmond on drums. There's 2 pianists that alternate. You've got Mal Waldron and Horace Parlin. You've got 2 trombone players, Jimmy Nepper and Willie Dennis. And then obviously you have Charles Mingus on bass. So just a really, really impressive lineup. Mingus had a tendency of surrounding himself with top players who could also kind of deal with his antics, and I think that's represented here. Even though I think Danny Richmond famously had perhaps one of the worst relationships with Mingus. It was a little bit off and on, but he does perform here. All right, so let's talk about that first track, and that is Wednesday Night Prayer Meeting. So on this reissue, on the Atlantic 75 reissue, I think what you're going to notice up front is a couple of things. One is that the saxophone, regardless of who's playing it, because there's 4 saxophonists here, the saxophone seems to be the star of this album and certainly this song. So the saxophonists, when they solo, when they have melodic statements, they just sound phenomenal, typically in the right channel, really bright, and they sound really good, like very, nicely detailed. They sound very natural, like the saxophones are supposed to sound, and it just sounds really good. And I think from a point of comparison, the layered horns, I guess in this case we're talking about trombones, there is a little bit of lack of detail, I think, with those, at least compared to the saxophone. But if anything, it almost feels like the instruments are very well balanced. It's just that then you have this like punchy saxophone on top of it, and it doesn't sound bad. I just thought it was interesting. And you know, here's the thing, it often, I would say, is difficult to capture detail in trombones, especially when they're doubled, and especially relative to, say, other instruments that have a much brighter sound that are just going to sound clearer, I think, on top. So the order of the solos, I want to say that John Handy has the first one, and then later Booker Ervin with his tenor solo. Both of those are just extremely dynamic. Like I said, I think that there's something about a saxophone that, especially in if the rest of the song has a little bit of sort of chaotic elements, it's really nice to have that bright saxophone just kind of shining out in front of everything else. So the way that I did this is I listened to that reissue first, and then I decided to play my mono. And sometimes when you know, if you haven't listened to an album in a little bit and you just listen to, say, the new one, different things are going to jump out at you versus if I, you know, perhaps started with the mono. But anyway, those are my comments for the Atlantic 75, specific to that first track. When I put on the original, that's when I noticed a lot more sort of these differences, I think, between the two pressings. So if the saxophone was what was kind of the wow factor on the 75 edition, on the original, the bass was much thinner. Not nearly as, I don't know, sort of robust. It just sounded significantly thinner. The saxophone I also found was considerably less dynamic. Perhaps it was better balanced with the other instruments, but the problem is that when you have them all playing simultaneously in some of these certain circumstances, you tend to lose some of the sound. And so I actually kind of liked the separation, partially achieved by the two channels, right? Left and right channel on the stereo, whereas my original is a mono, and it brings them together. The stereo, it feels like to me, allowed the saxophone to kind of come out just a little bit, and I did like that. I would say that the horn chorus, so again, we're talking about trombones, on the original was even less distinct than what was on the Atlantic 75 edition. And just generally, like I said before, it's just harder to pick out individual parts in the original pressing because it sort of blends together, whereas there was more separation between instruments, perhaps due to the stereo soundstage in the Atlantic 75 edition. There was a couple of elements too. So there's some shouts on this track and on the Wednesday night prayer meeting, and I noticed that some of it was distorted on the original, and I don't know if that's something that was specific to, say, all mono pressings, or maybe it's just mine, although my copy is really clean. There could have been some groove wear, though, it's possible, or it could just be that that's the sort of rawness that was captured in that original recording. Well, guess what? There isn't that distortion in the Atlantic 75 series. It seems to have been cleaned up, and it sounds really nice. And so I don't know if there's any other complaints. I mean, I said that the bass was sort of thin. I think that the drums are also, they felt like they were a little bit pushed to the back, or at least they're just not terribly pronounced, I think, on the original. It feels like to me that that the drums are just not necessarily the priority in the mix on either edition. And perhaps that was a choice in how it was recorded. Perhaps it was a reaction to everything that's going on, again, with this sort of choir of saxophones and trombones. Having there be drums on top of it that are loud and distinct may have just been too much. All right, so this next track that I want to talk about is Moanin'. And I intentionally listened to the editions backwards, right? So I first listened to the original, and then I listened to the Atlantic 75. And the first thing that I noticed, at least in terms of the, you know, how early it is in the track, is right up front, Pepper Adams' baritone. So he's the one he opens the song, and it's just him. There's no one else. He's like just playing this, this kind of repeating vamp. And there is significantly more detail in the Atlantic 75 edition with Pepper Adams' baritone, where you hear a bit of the sustain off the tail end of some of his notes, and it's so interesting to be able to hear that, because you don't hear any of that in the original mono, just completely absent. There is a little bit of high-level distortion in the saxophones as well on the original pressing, which you don't get any of in the reissue. The bass is more prominent on the reissue for sure. Similar to the early track, there's a better sense of sort of definition or distinctness, I think, between the individual instruments on the Atlantic 75 series, and so that sounds great. The saxophones here are just the star again, though. So this time you have Jackie McLean playing, I think, the first solo. He sounds fantastic. It's followed by Pepper Adams, and he sounds great as well. And then it's followed by Booker Ervin. Sorry, I'm kind of like losing my place. And I think all of these saxophones are in the right channel, which is kind of interesting. It is a little bit of like your focus wants to be in the right channel because they're all there, but that's just simply how they were spread in the mix. The solos on this track are actually kind of interesting because they represent a relative moment of order in the piece. So this is a piece where there's a lot of spontaneous improvisation, and that almost forms the melody because it happens just up front. There's just all of these layered instruments that are all playing completely different things, and it has this sense of cacophony. And once it shifts to these three saxophonists playing their solos, they are the only ones soloing, and so it's really interesting to have this almost counterpoint of it's not counterpoint, but this contradiction between the group spontaneous improvisation and then these like more blues focused solos by each of the soloists. Booker Ervin's tenor solo is particularly interesting because there's such a good sense of dynamics in his playing, and I guess I mean in terms of like loud and soft, and there's even this sense of him either backing away a little bit from the microphone or maybe just turning his saxophone a little bit. And you hear that. You're able to hear that subtlety in the recording. And it's just, it's really, really interesting. I don't know, it's just interesting to hear in again, one of these like 45 RPM audiophile style reissues that you get some of that. I just thought that this piece came across much nicer in the reissue. It's not even close. It's just there's so much more depth to the instruments. There's so much more emotion that is felt, I think, because the music just feels like fatter and not as thin, if that makes sense. All right, so if I could just say a couple of other things about some of these other pieces, and I'm not touching on every single one of them, and certainly not in detail, but Tensions is another one that I think is appropriately titled, has some dissonance, has some polyrhythmic elements with the horns sort of following one rhythm versus the drummer being slightly off that, or vice versa. And I really like that. The bass here is really nice detail actually in the bass. In fact, I think if Mingus's bass shines anywhere the most, it's on Tensions. It just sounds very natural, really, really good. Saxophones just constantly sound good throughout this entire album. They really are. Saxophones and bass are the highlights here for sure, and perhaps perhaps at the expense of drums and piano. I got to be honest. My Jelly Roll Soul is a great piece. It's a little bit of a throwback. There's some really nice bass detail there, especially up front. And then the last piece is called E's Flat, Oz Flat 2. Huge highlight. Love this track. Some really nice unison melody lines that don't just blend together and get muddy like they do on the original. Instead, there's it just feels like the instruments are well layered and there's distinctness to each of them. You can hear each of the parts. I just thought that they did such a good job considering how difficult, again, some of my upfront comments, this recording must have been. So the summary of what you've heard, at least in terms of this music, before I offer my kind of closing thoughts on the release, I guess as a whole, this is a very much a sort of ensemble-focused album. The saxophones really shine here. So you've got McLean, Handy, Irvin, and Pepper Adams, right? So you have four saxophonists. They really shine. Bass sounds excellent. Really adds weight and depth that the original just doesn't have. There's lots of sonic detail that keep it, but it keeps it sounding very natural. It's not like you have this like thunderous bass that doesn't make sense, right? The detail that's there and the depth that's there really makes you feel like what you're listening to is an acoustic bass, and that's good. If there's any complaints, I would say it's in the detail in the drums. They are a bit in the back, although they certainly sound better than on the original pressing. I don't know that they could be more pronounced, as I sort of previously stated, without the recording just sounding maybe too messy. So it's just kind of hard to say. Like, do I want more drums here? I kind of do. I feel like I'm used to hearing more drums in audiophile pressings. But I just don't know that that was necessarily the focus in how Mingus arranged this, this music. You know, and I think that because this is such a loud recording with so much going on, and some of the instruments, you know, sort of, they just have this intensity that's borderline overblowing at points, you almost expect that the drums would just really be, that Danny Richmond would just be really going after the drums, and he isn't. And so I think it's, you know, it's balanced, but maybe I expected a little bit more. Maybe that's what I would say. And certainly it's better than the original mono. I do enjoy listening to this in stereo. I love the soundstage. And listen, I've had an original stereo in the past, and I sold it because I preferred how the mono sounded. So now that I'm going back to this stereo in this 45 RPM format, it is interesting that I think now I prefer listening to it in this format, and I think it's because of just how much better some of the instruments sound versus in the original, where they're just thinner. So I personally think that what Atlantic has done, independent of how this thing was sourced, and the fact that this is the very first edition that they've put out, at least in terms of catalog number, I do think that they simultaneously released a couple of others non-jazz titles. I think that this series is off to an amazing start. Am I necessarily going to pick up every single release? Well, certainly not. I'm not picking up every single release. Am I going to pick up every jazz release? Probably not either. What I will do is pick up the titles that I'm, you know, particularly excited about, that I really want to hear what this series could, you know, how it could treat the music. Obviously, I was going to pick up this one because it's one of my top favorite jazz records of all time. Personally, I think Giant Steps would probably be another good candidate because I love the music, and I just haven't heard any audiophile pressing. I've got like I have an early stereo, maybe a stereo original, actually, of that title. And might I pick up this reissue and hear how it sounds? I might. So there we have it. Those are my thoughts. It feels like to me there's a lot of people who wanted to hate this, hate the series, perhaps because of the price point, perhaps because it was I don't know, maybe quasi-exclusive, right? With the you know, the numbered editions on the back. In fact, I didn't even reference that. You know, my number is 982. I didn't pay to have a specific edition because then you'd need to get a subscription to the entire thing, and I wasn't going to do that, obviously. But I can't say that they did a bad job with this, because they did a great job. This edition sounds great. For anybody who hasn't listened to this album before, I think this is a fantastic way to hear it. And yeah, this is just a strong recommend from me. So thanks as always for sticking with me. Appreciate your time, and I'll see you next time.